you for joining us for today's Print Month program. I'm Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation. Today, we have the second program in the series presented by our friends at Print Council of America, Themes and Variations, Poetic Science, The Origins of Digital Printmaking with Leslie Jones and Debora Wood, will be introduced more fully by Mary Weaver Chapin. Mary's asked for a very brief bio, so here it is. Mary is Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Portland Art Museum and the President of Print Council of America. As a reminder, this program is being recorded and will be available along with the other 19 programs that comprise Print Month 2021 on the IFPDA website. If you have questions, and we hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box. With an exciting 255 registered to attend this program, we'll get to as many as we can. And with that, I turn it over to my dear friend, Mary Weaver Chapin.
Thank you, Jenny, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of those of you joining us across the time zones. And thank you for that introduction, Jenny. I wanted to keep it very brief because I am so excited to hear about the work of my dear friends, Debora Wood and Leslie Jones. And I have had the good fortune of knowing both of these outstanding scholars for many, many years. And I've heard little bits about this exhibition over the course of several years and can't wait to learn more. I'd like to start by thanking Jenny Gibbs and Sherry Young for putting together such a rich array of programming this month in October. They make it look so easy, but I know it requires endless amount of organization and practice. So thank you, Jenny and Sherry. As Jenny mentioned, I am the president of Print Council of America, and Print Council is offering 3 talks this month as part of Print Week. We are calling them Themes and Variations, Topics from Print Council of America, and they highlight the diverse research of our group. Print Council was founded in 1956 with the mission to foster the creation, dissemination, and appreciation of fine prints, old and new. Today, we continue this mission with a membership of approximately 300 curators, scholars, and conservators devoted to the graphic arts. Today, we will hear from Leslie and Debora on a very exciting topic. But first, a little bit about our speakers. Leslie Jones is Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where she has curated numerous exhibitions, including the LACMA version of The Serial Impulse at Gemini GEL with Naoko Takahatake, and Ed Moses, Drawings from the 1960s and 70s, and another outstanding show, Drawing Surrealism, that was in 2012. She also was the curator of the outstanding show John Baldessari, Pure Beauty. She writes regularly on the subject of modern and contemporary drawings and prints. Her most recent publications include Marx Slowed Down, Julie Moretto's Italio Prints, and The Personal is Computable, Sonia Rappaport, and that appeared in Art in Print in January 2019, and Alan Ruppersberg Drawing, appearing in 2014. Leslie is currently preparing for the exhibition Coded, Art Enters the Computer Age, 1960 to 1980, scheduled to open at LACMA in 2023. Welcome, Leslie. And now I'm pleased to introduce Debora Wood. Debora is an independent curator and scholar. She's also my devoted vice president for Print Council of America and putting her excellent organizational talents to use for our group. She is currently an independent scholar and curator, and she is the former senior curator at the Mary and Lee Block Museum of Art at the Northwestern University campus. She has organized many exhibitions, including Dorothy and Herb Vogel on Drawing in 2014, Imaging by Numbers, a historical view of the computer print in 2008, and Marion Mahoney Griffin, Drawing the Form of Nature, 2005. She is a contributing author to Coded, Works on Paper, Coded, Art Enters the Computer Age, the exhibition I mentioned that Leslie is curating, and Matisse Paintings, works on paper, sculptures, and textiles at the Art Institute of Chicago. Another outstanding exhibition she worked on is Algorithm, Idea, Machine, and Art from 2015. Deb lectures on a wide array of subjects, including satirical prints, plastics and printmaking in the 1960s and 1970s, and Robert Rauschenberg's prints. Leslie and Deborah, welcome, and thank you for being here this morning. I look forward to hearing your talk, and I'll meet you at the back end for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mary, first of all, for the invitation to present as part of the Print Council of America's series. It's a great honor. And thanks also to Jenny and Sherry for including us in the IFPDA's amazing roster of Print Month events. And thank you, viewers. Deborah and I are delighted to be here and share in our mutual interest in early computer-generated art. We'll trace the origins of digital printmaking, but along the way, show some works that could be described as drawings rather than prints. We'd like to hear your thoughts on that at the end. The scope of today's presentation is work made from the early 1950s to the early 1980s, which corresponds with the rise of mainframe computing and before the personal computer. You're seeing here now the covers of Time magazine. On the left, the cover from 1965, and on the right, a cover from 1983, which nicely frames the chronological parameters of our talk, but also shows the different popular perceptions of the computer at those different times. Of course, on the left, you have the computer as a voracious electronic brain consuming punch cards. And on the right, you have the computer moving in, basically becoming just another domestic appliance in people's homes. Can I have the next slide? Great, thank you. As a reminder, this is what the computer looked like at the time. An IBM 1401 mainframe with all its peripherals. It was in widespread use by the mid to late 1960s. Our presentation today will be largely chronological, so we can show how the work changed and varied with new technology, and in particular with different output devices. By output devices, we mean how the image was transferred from the computer to paper, which was not as easy as it is today. There was no Alt-P or Control-P. Microfilm recorders, plotter printers, and impact printers are some of the earliest output devices we'll discuss, along with various examples of art created with them. You also need to keep in mind that access to mainframe computers was extremely limited due to their expense and size. They were the domain of the government, military, and large corporations. In most cases, it was major universities that provided a gateway for artists interested in exploring the computer's creative potential. In addition, there was no graphic software available for artists, so they had to write their own programs or work with technicians. And this, we think, is sort of an interesting parallel with traditional printmaking. In many cases, the technicians or engineers were the artists themselves.
And that brings us to the title of our talk, Poetic Science, which is a nod to the great English mathematician Ada Lovelace. The daughter of poet Lord Byron and mathematician Lady Anne Byron, Ada Lovelace described her work as poetical science. She imagined creative uses for Charles Babbage's analytical engine, something beyond basic mathematical calculations, and in the process, scripted an algorithm for the machine. For this reason, she is considered to be one of the first computer programmers. Fast forward now to the 1950s to consider for a moment the eternal question, can machines think? Or, as Alan Turing phrased it, are there imaginable digital computers that would do well in the imitation game? Turing's seminal lecture at the University of Manchester inspired physicist Christopher Strachey to write literary programs for a computer to compose original love letters. Each begins with a greeting and ends with a valediction and are signed MUC for Manchester University Computer.
The same year, Strachey's computer writes love letters. Ben F. Leposky, a mathematician and artist from Cherokee, Iowa, appropriated a cathode ray oscilloscope to create images for purely aesthetic reasons. An oscilloscope is an electronic instrument that takes an electrical signal as input and displays the waveform on a screen. They were and are still used in many different disciplines, including medicine, engineering, and telecommunications. According to Leposky, quote, "Since the technology of electronics has become such an important part of modern life, it is inevitable that it be employed in the creation of art," end quote. Now, in order to do this, Leposky built a generator to amplify and manipulate electronic waveforms, which he then photographed with high-speed film. You can see his contraption here to the right in the slide. He made photographs because at the time there was no other means of transferring the flickering light display to paper. He called his artistic creations oscillons, and they were exhibited throughout the US as electronic abstractions. Now, Leposky was not alone. The American filmmaker, Mary Ellen Butte, who you see here, used an oscilloscope to make films. And on the left, we have a still from one of her films. In Europe, the Austrian scientist and artist Herbert Franke, who would become a pioneer and major proponent of computer-generated art, also explored the oscilloscope's creative potential. He called his works oscillograms. Next slide, please. Oscillons and oscillograms were, of course, analog precursors. Before we move on to early digital works, here are a couple more examples of works made using an analog computer. These are by the British artist Desmond Paul Henry, who constructed drawing machines from modified analog computers originally employed in World War II bombers to calculate the accurate release of bombs onto their targets. Henry's drawing machines could not be pre-programmed, so he let the machine do its own thing. Those are his words. The results were unpredictable, curvilinear graphics that Henry would sometimes enhance with duplicator ink or markers, as in these two very colorful examples, both in the collection of the Toma Foundation. While chance and randomness would play an important role in early digital art, these works can also be related to the metamatic drawing contraptions of Yves Tanguy in the late 1950s.
The first digital output device we're going to discuss is the Stromberg-Carlson 4020. It was introduced in 1958, and at the time, it was revolutionary in terms of speed and multiple applications. This machine could either operate online with a digital computer or receive instructions via magnetic tape signals. In the background center here, you can see several tape reels on a shelf, and the woman next to it is loading a tape into the machine. The CS4020 converts binary signals from the tape to combinations of alphanumeric printing, curvilinear plotting, and line drawings. As a result, the results could be printed either on microfilm or photo recording paper. The woman in the foreground left is installing the camera for the photo recording paper. In this view of the Stromberg-Carlson shows the caricatron-shaped beam tube that decodes information into characters or symbols, curves, and vectors. The CS4020 was primarily used for scientific and technological applications, such as plotting charts and business graphs, mapping, and drawing electronic diagrams. But like the mainframe computer, the CS4020 was large-scale, expensive, and not available to everyone. One of the preeminent research institutions, Bell Telephone Laboratories, not only had a Stromberg Carlson, it fostered a culture of creative imagination and investigation. And if you would like to explore this topic further, Zabet Patterson has written a very entertaining book called Peripheral Vision, Bell Labs, the CS4020, and the Origins of Computer Art.
Yes, Bell Labs was basically a hotbed of exploration in art and technology, as demonstrated in the experiments of Bell Labs engineer A. Michael Knoll, who in 1964 created this work, Computer Composition with Lines, using a Stromberg Carlson. As I'm sure you've guessed, the work was inspired by the 1917 painting Composition with Lines by Piet Mondrian. To create his version, Knoll entered statistics about the lengths, widths, and densities of the horizontal and vertical bars characteristic of Mondrian's painting into the mainframe, and then used a pseudo-random number generator to place them within the composition. By factoring in randomness, Knoll and others were seeking to simulate artistic intuition, and we'll see more examples of that. The image was then output to microfilm using the Stromberg Carlson, the limitations of which, as Knoll admits, informed his selection of the Mondrian as a test case. According to Knoll, the microfilm plotter is presently limited to producing black and white pictures composed of connected and disconnected line segments. Mondrian's composition with lines, a black and white painting composed of vertical and horizontal bars, was a type picture that the microfilm plotter was capable of reproducing with suitable programming of the computer, end quote. Mondrian's painting with its minimal components was thus chosen for its programming potential. And it's interesting to note, however, that in their quest to legitimize the computer as an artistic tool and distinguish it from purely scientific illustration, many artists sought models in the history of art, like Mondrian and Klee, who we'll see later.
Now, before we get into this next work, which is also made on the Stromberg Carlson, I want everyone to take a moment to appreciate what it looks like close up. The original work is quite large. The intent was that viewers might see the details before taking in the full image. Like Knoll's work, this too was made at Bell Labs. At close range, you can see the Greek letter alpha, which is arranged to make several different micropatterns. These micropatterns include mathematical symbols and icons used in drawing electrical schematics, but their arrangement is chaotic and nonsensical. Some of the symbols are sideways. If we pull back to view the full composition, the details blend together to reveal a figure study of a reclining female. This work was made in the fall of 1966 by Leon Harmon, who studied human perception, and Kenneth C. Knowlton, who developed programming languages and interactive techniques for computer graphics. They made this work as a surprise gift for their departmental director, Edward E. David, when he was out of town. Needing a model for their work, Harmon and Knowlton asked their supervisor, Max Matthews, if he could help. Matthews spoke to Billy Kluver, who had many connections to the art world through his collaborations with Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, John Cage, and others. Kluver called Deborah Hay, a choreographer and modern dancer who worked with Kluver to create a performance for 9 evenings, theater, and engineering. Hay agreed to pose, and Harmon took the photograph with a conventional film camera. He and Knowlton scanned the photo into the computer and ran it through Knowlton's program that converted the smooth shadows and highlights of the figure into micropatterns, each of which represented a different shade of gray. The processed image was sent through the Stromberg Carlson and printed onto 6 frames of microfilm, which they then cut and pasted together and rephotographed to make a larger 8x10 negative. From that negative, they produced this 12-foot wide photograph, which they hung in David's office. The image became a seminal representation of art and technology in the mid-20th century. Smaller versions of the photograph were exhibited at MoMA, Brooklyn, ICA in London, and in Zagreb, and there are many different print editions of this work. But it is at its original 12-foot wide scale, which you can see here, that the work can truly be appreciated.
Great. Moving on from the microfilm recorder, we will now turn to plotter printers, which were the most popular and available output devices of the time. Here we are looking at a CalComp flatbed plotter made by California Computer Products here in Southern California. A plotter is a mechanical device that holds a pen or other implement and is linked to a computer that controls its movement across the drawing surface. They were used widely in the US and attractive to artists because they executed continuous lines akin to drawing. A variation of the same technology was the drum plotter, which used a rolling cylinder to move the paper while the pens moved back and forth. And that's what you see here on the right.
And here is a slightly smaller flatbed plotter invented by Konrad Zuse from Siemens Corporation, which was popular in Germany. Friedrich Nake had access to a Zuse Graphomat plotter when he was a student at the Technical University in Stuttgart. Nake wrote algorithmic programs to instruct the computer how to draw an image. An algorithm is defined as a clearly delineated, step-by-step procedure usually used for solving mathematical problems. In computer graphics, a random element is written into the program to create variations of form and to allow certain parameters to be interchanged. By incorporating an element of random selection, not only is the final composition unknown, but endless variations of the composition can also be produced. To create this tribute to Swiss artist Paul Klee, Friedrich Nake systematically applied mathematical randomness to determine the details of the picture. Nake said, randomness must be seen in analogy to the artist who pursues a theme using intuition for the selection of possibilities from a certain repertoire. At the time this work was made, it would take an entire evening for the computer plotter to draw the image. There was also no monitor to see what the work would look like in advance. So in this regard, each drawing was a surprise. The title of this work, Homage to Paul Klee, 13/9/65, number 2, indicates that this impression was the computer's second execution of Nake's program, generated on September 13th, 1965. Nake did not like the results from September 12th, so he threw it away.
There's always artistic license, right?
Yes.
Here we have more plotter drawings by Nake from a few years later, made with his walk-through raster program. Nake could designate the number of squares, but their placement was programmed to be random. And in order to get the two colors, Nake would have had to change the plotter ink at some point in the printing process. Numerous examples were printed from this program, all different, but the possibilities are really infinite. For Nake and other artist programmers, the plotted drawings were but glimpses into the program's potential. According to Nake, the traditional artist deals with the one drawing. The programmer describes the schema of all of the drawings, end quote. This introduces an interesting notion of the program as an infinitely variable matrix. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this at the end of the presentation. Feel free to just put them into the Q&A. Doesn't have to be a question. Another artist who has worked extensively with a plotter is Vera Molnar, a very significant figure in the history of computer art and in art in general. Up until this point, the work we have looked at has been by people trained in the scientific fields, like engineers and mathematicians, who came to art by circumstance. Molnar, born in Hungary and active in Paris, still today, she's 97 years old, was trained as an artist and associated with geometric abstraction and concrete art in the 1950s. The computer allowed her to expand on her already systematic approach. This drawing from the Morgan's collection was one of the first she produced with a computer and is part of a series called Interruptions from 1968. And I'd just like to stop briefly and mention an anecdote that Molnar loves to tell. The year 1968, she's at the Sorbonne, and while everyone else was in the streets protesting, she was hunkered down, taking advantage and working in the computer lab. The algorithm for this work states, quote, on a square, create diagonal lines only, but distribute them so that some areas remain empty, end quote. Those areas were randomly selected by the computer. In 1970, Molnar began a series titled Searching for Paul Klee that takes Klee's 1927 painting Variations as its starting point. This painting, Variations, is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. She was drawn to the work's grid structure and equitable distribution of elements. Like Knoll and Nake, Molnar was drawn to the work's programmability. According to Molnar, quote, the directive for acting was place parallel lines within a square grid and vary the alignment, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and the weight of lines as well as their closeness. Hopefully you can see some of that in the detail to the right. Yet she multiplied the grid exponentially to measure, by my count, 70 by 70 or 4,900 squares, compared to Klee's, which measured 9 by 9. Suggests the infinite possibilities of newfound technology. It flexes the power of the computer without losing the essential whimsy of Klee's original. The computer allowed Molnar to work at an unprecedented speed and efficiency to, in her words, bring to light and to realize images which only pre-existed in a vague, uncertain way in my imagination.
Like Molnar, Manfred Mohr began his artistic career working in traditional media, painting, printmaking, and also as a jazz musician. On the left, he is making a lithograph on the Fusten-Lang press at École des Beaux-Arts. The photograph on the right, taken a few years later, shows Mohr watching a plotter generate a drawing from one of his programs. By the early 1960s, Mohr began working almost exclusively in black and white, focusing on geometric abstraction. Mohr's attraction to the computer began with his interest in the computer-generated music of French composer Pierre Barbeau and the aesthetic philosophies of Max Benz. Mohr recalled, I wanted more than anything to be able to use a real computer and a plotter. But at that time, a computer still filled an entire room and was unaffordable, something costing millions. But with a little luck and plenty of juvenile impudence, I was finally able to gain access to the Meteorological Institute in Paris. This is where the gates of paradise opened. At night, I was allowed to use the computer and an enormous Benson flatbed plotter. Mohr taught himself how to program so he would have complete control over the results. This work, P049 for Program 49, formal language, represents a turning point in the artist's oeuvre when he began working exclusively with algorithms to create art.
Here we have another example in the collection of the Whitney Museum. Mohr used algorithms because they resulted in work that could not be realized in any other way. It is not necessarily the system or the logic I want to present in my work, said Mohr, but the visual invention that results from it. My artistic goal is reached when a finished work can visually disassociate itself from its logical content and convincingly stand as an independent, abstract entity. This work here reminds me of writing or language or even musical notation, given his background. Mohr introduced the cube in 1972 and concentrated on fracturing its symmetry and using its structure as a system and alphabet. On the right is a detail. In this work, the program ran all the possible combinations of lines that form a cube and may remind you of a certain conceptual artist working at the same time, albeit without a computer.
As we've shown, early computer artists worked in traditional genres such as abstraction, figure studies, and as seen here, the landscape. This work is by the husband and wife team, Charles Jeffries and Colette Stube Bangert. The subject of all of Colette's work, which is based in traditional media, painting, drawing, textiles, is landscape. Jeff, a mathematician, worked at the Computing Center at the University of Kansas. When the department acquired a Calcom plotter, Jeff was asked to test it, which he did in collaboration with Colette. The elements of both Jeff's computing work and Colette's handwork involve repetitive tasks, so making a computer art together seemed a natural progression. Colette signs all of her independent work CSB, but the algorithmic work made with Jeff are signed CB, C standing for both Charles and Colette, as if the work is by one person. This plotter drawing, Large Landscape, is an early example of using color inks for purely aesthetic purposes. In this detail, you can more clearly see the two colors of ink, black and ochre. The Bangert's early landscape plotter drawings are also significant because they employ randomized curvilinear line rather than geometric shapes to create an all-over composition of soft textures that call to mind wind blowing across grassy plains. The random process employed by the algorithm mimic the natural variety of plant life. No two lines are the same.
10 years later, the Bangerts continued to explore the grass theme, now with more color, and this work is part of an extensive series that is a bit more regimented compositionally, but still very much in touch with the sense of nature that inspired them. This is in the collection of Anne and Michael Spalter. And I like to think of this, the Bangerts as sort of the Agnes Martin of the Midwest. The way they took a natural motif, especially Colette, and just explored it sort of ad infinitum with always surprisingly new and fascinating results. For our last plotter example, we have this mesmerizing work by Jean-Pierre Hébert, who was an engineer and computer scientist, but made art throughout his life and computer art beginning in the 1970s. Hébert was French-born, but based in Santa Barbara since 1985, where until his recent passing, he was the artist in residence at the Cogley Institute for Theoretical Physics at UCSB. As you can see, the composition is quite complex and layered, a network of geometric and organic forms that reflect his interest in Mondrian, as well as weavings by Annie Albers. According to Hébert, he sought in his work, quote, an ideal of beauty and ideal Platonic forms, inspired by my interests in patterns of geometry, mathematics, physics, and nature, end quote. Although this work was programmed in 1975, it wasn't printed out until the 1980s when he acquired a plotter that was up to the task, a Hewlett-Packard drum plotter. Now, the last output device in use at the time was the impact printer, also known as a line printer. As its name suggests, the impact printer uses physical force to apply the design to paper, similar to a typewriter. The IBM 1403, shown here, had a spinning chain with hammers to strike the characters, which were letters, numbers, punctuation marks, basically what you would find on a keyboard today. And I'm showing here the spinning chain in the bottom part of this slide. Now, fewer artists worked with impact printers than with plotters, but there was nonetheless a contingent out of the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque, and later the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, who worked with a program called Art1. Developed by the University of New Mexico engineer Richard Williams in consultation with artist Catherine Nash, Art1 allowed artists to create simple shapes such as rectangles, circles, lines, and ellipses using the characters available on the impact printer. And if you are interested in this particular moment in computer art history, I would direct you to Patrick Frank's recent book called Sharing Code, Art1, Frederick Hammersley, and the Dawn of Computer Art. Now, the American artist Frederick Hammersley, whose work we've been looking at, created computer drawings using Art1 in 1969-1970 when he first arrived at the University of New Mexico after establishing himself as a hard-edge geometric painter here in Los Angeles. The foray into computer art only lasted a year or so, but during that time, he basically made nothing else, resulting in hundreds of variations. And among artists using Art1, they stand out as impressive for their ingenuity. The working area or grid of each of Hammersley's computer drawings measured 50 characters high by 105 characters wide. The program allowed for 2 arrays, which meant the printer could double or overstrike, creating darker or denser marks. You are looking at an example of Hammersley's use of 2 arrays in which a dash overlaps the letter I to create a middle tone. This is in the detail on the right. And the letters I and H overlap to create a darker one. Basically a means of shading, to use drawing terminology. And Hammersley was, of course, an avid drawer throughout his life. I just like to show another example because there's so many. This one called Jelly Centers, and these are in the collection of LACMA, I'm proud to say. And also just note Hammersley's wonderful sense of humor. He titled everything very cleverly. Now, given the limitations of graphic software, much early computer art was geometric and abstract in nature, as we have seen. And in many cases, this was the artist's preferred mode, as with Molnar, Mohr, the Bangerts, and others. This did not, however, prevent artists from making bold political statements, despite the limitations, and not to mention the computer's somewhat complicated association with the military-industrial complex. And that's a whole nother subject for another talk. But we did feel it was important to show you these more political works, or more boldly political works. American artist Charles Surrey's Random War is a case in point. Measuring 8 feet across, this computer-generated image made on a drum plotter depicts 400 soldiers, modeled after the single machine gun firing figure from the set of Little Green Toy Soldiers, or army men owned by many children at the time. In Surrey's Game of War, the soldiers are coded by the color red or black to designate their side, and using a pseudo-random number generator, distributed and placed in positions across the battlefield and far into the distance, designated by their diminishing scale. Some are standing, some are falling, and some have fallen into piles. In some areas, soldiers from the same side fire at one another, pointing clearly to the random and nonsensical nature of war. Surrey was a professor in the art department at Ohio State, where he gained access to the IBM 7094 computer and drum plotter. The programmer James Schaefer and professor of mathematics Dr. Leslie Miller wrote functions and code for him between 1965 and 1972. Random War was a bold protest against the Vietnam War. It was also personal. Surrey was a decorated veteran of World War II, where he fought at the Battle of the Bulge, so he knew well the experience of the battlefield and the horrors of war. He personalized his war by adding his own name to the list of soldiers that runs along the top of the composition, along with names of administrators, faculty, and staff from Ohio State, as well as then California Governor Ronald Reagan and Michigan Congressman and House Minority Leader Gerald Ford. The list also indicated each soldier's rank, medals awarded, and their status: dead, wounded, missing, or survived, all determined randomly. Another example is Brazilian artist Waldemar Cordeiro's powerful portrait of a Vietnamese woman in anguish, a bold anti-war statement derived from a news photograph that was the result of a complex process of hand digitization, coding, and programming that the artist devised with the help of physicist Giorgio Moscati, who had access to an IBM 360 at the University of Sao Paulo. Numbers from 1 to 7 were assigned to the different values, dark to light, in the original photograph for approximately 10,000 points or pixels, of which 25% were assigned randomly as dark points to introduce noise or interference into the final image. Cordeiro wanted viewers to question popular imagery, which also relates to his enigmatic title for this work, The Woman Who Is Not BB. BB stands for Brigitte Bardot, the French actress and sex symbol who represented glamour in pop culture at the time. Cordeiro's woman was not that. The contrast heightens the disparity and calls attention to the media's problematic use of spectacle.
For Sonia Rappaport, as you have said, Leslie, the personal is computable. Rappaport's feminist perspective informs her artistic practice that involves a kind of pseudoscience. The work at the left originated from a series of interactive performances. Participants were asked to choose a footrest, either a velvet cushion or an old iron shoe form or a plywood box, which they rested their foot on for their shoe's portrait photograph. They were then asked a series of questions such as, how happy are you with your shoes? Where did you get your shoes? What do you use your shoes for? The answers were calculated in a computer program that plotted their shoe psyche or shoe field. At the end, participants were asked to put their shoes on one of 5 different black tile designs that best matched their psyche level. Shoe field map, made on an impact printer, commemorates the events. Mapping emotions and psychological attachments, which are tied to concepts of women, subvert the male-dominated fields of science and technology. Now, we're going to shift gears here for a moment to talk briefly about prints that were made from images generated by the computer. While there are many such examples, we'll introduce just a few, beginning with this work by 2 members of the Computer Technique Group Tokyo. It is one of 7 lithographs from the portfolio produced on the occasion of the exhibition Cybernetic Serendipity, which opened at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, London in 1968. Masao Kimura conceived of an image in which a square transforms into the profile of a woman. The metamorphosis program was executed by Kunio Yamanaka. The original work was made on a Calcom 563 drum plotter, which you can see in the photograph. The 6 screen prints in this portfolio transformed the computer printout into brilliant colors. The portfolio features 3 artists who we've already discussed, Knowlton, Nake, and Mohr, and 3 other equally important artists whose work I'm afraid we won't have time to go into too much depth. We want to save time for questions and discussions. but please do make a note of their names and seek out more of their work. All of them write original algorithms to generate beautiful artworks. To the right is Hiroshi Kawano. And here on the left is Georg Nace, and on the right, Manuel Barbadillo. Now, some have suggested that prints such as these were made to validate computer art by presenting it in the guise of traditional media. Or perhaps the prints were simply a way to disseminate their work to a wider audience. Another artist who made prints from his computer-generated images was Otto Beckmann. He believed in the fluid transition between all artistic media and technology. He made paintings, sculptures, films, photographs, and prints, all of which incorporated forms generated by the computer. On the right, you see Beckmann's studio computer, which was built by his son, Oscar, which he made specifically designed for his father's interests in mind. Beckmann generated dynamic forms in real time, and similar to Leposki and Franca, Beckmann photographed the flickering light displayed on the screen. On the wall in the background, you can see some of his photographs and lithographs. To make the large print on the left, Beckmann translated a computer-generated form to a woodblock, which he then carved and printed by hand. This print is from a substantial body of work Beckmann called imaginary architecture.
Great. So no discussion of early computer art is complete without mention of Harold Cohen, whose early exploration of artificial intelligence related to drawing was way ahead of its time. Cohen was British, but landed a position teaching at UC San Diego in the late 1960s, where he remained until his passing in 2016. He is best known for Aaron, a computer program designed to produce art autonomously. Inspired by petroglyphs believed to have been made by the ancestors of the indigenous Owens Valley Paiute or Shoshone Paiute people in Northern California, Cohen was interested in how marks came together to create meaning. In this 1974 drawing, Aaron was programmed to avoid overlapping and create forms of varying size while relying on randomness for placement. The forms were then hand-colored by Cohen, adding a childlike quality, seemingly appropriate for Aaron's first drawings. The images are not that specific, but like the petroglyphs that inspired them, they have the potential for multiple meanings and tap into the human propensity for symbols. A few years later, Aaron was featured in two major museum exhibitions at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 1977 and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 1979, where this installation photograph was taken. Cohen had developed the program to the point where a roaming cart, aka turtle, rather than a plotter printer, could draw a great variety of organic forms and lines.
We're going to end our presentation with the introduction of the microcomputer and the work of Joan Truckenbrod. In 1978, Truckenbrod received a grant from Apple Computer for an Apple II. She wrote an algorithmic program in Fortran programming language to generate a sequential series of patterns representing visible phenomena in motion. The Apple II video output displayed very limited, yet vibrant range of colors. However, it was still not possible to print the brilliant colors she could see on the monitor onto paper. In order to get her images off the monitor, Joan moved her computer next to a 3M color-in-color photocopier. Each time her image came on the computer monitor, Joan picked up the monitor, turned it upside down on top of the photocopier, and pressed print. The 3M copier had a blacklight backlight setting. So it was possible for it to sort of see the image that was displayed on the monitor. Each print was then put onto heat transfer paper, which he then trimmed off the white border, placed it on sort of ink side down onto the face of a polyester fabric, which she then hand ironed to transfer the image from the paper to the cloth.
It's actually the perfect example of the union of analog and digital. And it's also just a great example of the length an artist will go to adapt new technologies to their practice. Working with computers in the age of the mainframe was not easy, as I hope we've demonstrated, but the artists we have presented, among others, laid the groundwork for those working today who have access to a wide variety of graphic software and don't have to think twice about how to print it out. They just click. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie and Deborah. That was marvelous. Maybe we'll ask you to stop screen share so we can see your faces. And I wish we had a week, a whole seminar on this topic, because there are lots of good questions. And I would like to start with one that you just sort of tantalizingly brought up at the beginning. Is computer-generated work a drawing or a print?
I'll start off answering that while Leslie negotiates audio. But for me, and this just comes from talking with some of these artists, I think it depends on the tool that was used to create the work, and really how the artist thinks of their approach to the work. Because in so many cases, when artists were working with plotters, they really do call them drawings, and they were very clear about selecting certain inks, selecting certain papers, in the same way that artists select different inks and papers for the mark that that tool creates in motion. I think also because some of the plotters, as we saw with that close-up of the Zeus graphomat that Nake was working on, where it was making the spiral, and when I think about Colette and Jeff Bangert's work, the curvilinear forms, there's a flow to those images that truly mimics the flow of an artist using traditional drawing media. For me, the question is really when you get into work of someone like Manfred Mohr, who made an original drawing in 1969, 1970, but then it's redrawn exactly in, I don't know, 78 or something. I have more difficulties wrapping my head around something like that, about whether or not to call it a print or a drawing.
Well,
Leslie?
I'm sure there can be some good debate. Oh, can we hear, Leslie, are you back on?
Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Sorry to go back to that question. It really is for me very kind of hybrid. I mean, I tend to think of them more as drawings because they're sort of open-ended and experimental. But at the same time, there's so much overlap with printmaking in the terms of often requiring someone to work with, you know, to have like a technician or printmaker. And also the fact that they kind of exist on the periphery and sort of on the margins in a way that prints do, especially if an artist is working in another medium.
I'm just glancing to my right here because there's so many good questions coming in. Let's go with, let's start with a fairly straightforward one. Let's talk about additions. Does that concept make sense when we're talking about computer-generated art? Do you think of these as additions like prints, or is that kind of a special aspect of this programming?
Well, I think most of them were either unique, right? Or an example of done in series. But they still feel more like drawing. So I don't know, it goes back to that question or that issue I introduced in regard to Frieder Nake about the infinitely variable matrix. I mean, is there a parallel in printmaking for that? I was thinking kind of about monoprints. And in that case, could they be additioned? But monoprints aren't necessarily additioned that way. So I don't know, again, part of what fascinates me about this work is that it doesn't fit neatly into any category.
Great. Our friend Ben Levy asks a question along those lines. He says that your talk has delightfully complicated our conventional definitions of medium and the relationships of input and output, art and technology. Could you speak to any reverberations you see this project having in the field more broadly? What did this set in motion?
Well, I mean, I think artists like Otto Beckmann is an example of someone who moved so freely between media that, and there are also many artists today who, you no longer have to major in a particular area of specialty. For example, when I was a student at Cornell, working on my BFA, I had to choose a major. I double majored in painting and printmaking and received degrees with that area of specialty. But today it is, Cornell gives just a Bachelor of Fine Arts in art because there is no limitation. I guess I would say, and I think that speaks to the hybrid nature of these works and what Leslie is talking about.
Yeah, that's a great example, Deborah. It makes it very concrete. We have lots of great questions coming in. Deborah and Leslie, if you're willing to stay on and answer a few more, I'd like to keep going, but I just want to let all of our viewers know that if you do need to dash off, this talk is being recorded and you can come up, catch up later. But let's go to a really fascinating question about women in this field. As I was taking notes, I noticed some really impressive contributions by women in this endeavor, starting with Vera Molnar, maybe even going back to that very first image you showed of the first, what was her name?
Lovelace.
Lovelace, yes. And then all the way up to Joan Truckenbrod. And one of our viewers asks about whether the barriers for women to enter this were higher because it was sort of the domain of scientists and coders, or they were lower because we weren't really sure, what is this? Is this art? Is this science? Could you just talk a little bit about the role of women in this movement and what you think either their barriers or their opportunities were?
I think there were both. I think if you are a woman in the tech field, like Rebecca Allen is a computer graphics artist who was in that field. She was the only woman. She had to really, fight to get where she is today. At the same time, if you were like at a university and you had access to a computer, I think women artists were drawn to new technology as they were with video because it didn't have the baggage of art history, which was, largely male dominated. So it was a new media for a new times. And, it's important to note that this is going on in the 60s and 70s. So you have women's liberation, the rise of feminism, more women having the option to become artists. And, it would make sense that they would gravitate to a new media like the computer.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Leslie. One thing I jotted down as you were speaking is what a very international movement this seems to be. I think we heard from artists from Austria, the British artists, German, Spanish, French, American. Can you speak a little bit to the international nature of this and let us know, were they in touch with each other, or was this sort of happening simultaneously but without connection?
Yes, it's happening all over the world, is the short answer. What's that?
There were centers.
But there were, yes, there were definitely centers, and those centers, I think, were where the equipment was available, where the tools were available, and also how flexible your employer is for you to be able to use equipment. Georg Nace talks about the fact that his supervisors just tolerated his creative experiments with their equipment, whereas at Bell Labs, it was much more flexible environment to see an overlap, and also at universities to see that overlap between art and technology.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings up another question. Can you remind me, where was Bell Labs located?
Murray Hill, New Jersey,
okay,
was their headquarters.
And our friend Ann Schaefer asks, where did you find these prints? How did you suss them out? Are there general repositories? Does Bell Labs keep an archive? Or what if we wanted to go see a great number of these? We would naturally come to your show, Leslie, in 2023. But tell us a little bit about where you found works for the exhibition.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, because there are repositories in museums, namely the Victoria and Albert Museum in London has a large repository.
Kunsthal Bremen.
The Kunsthal in Bremen
Huge.
has the ZKM in Germany. And in the States, though, it's more private collectors, and we mentioned them or presented works of, from these collections, the Anne and Michael Spalter Digital Art Collection, and the Carl and Marilyn Thoma Foundation Collection. These are two private, private foundations or couples that have acquired deeply in this area.
But also, I should mention, just to back up in history a bit, the Block Museum, where I was senior curator, has a substantial collection, and that their collection came out of an exhibition that I organized with Paul Hertz in, what did I say there, 2007, 2008. And when we were working on that, there it is. When we were working on that exhibition, I have to say that that was a show that was in planning for almost 8 years. And at the time that we began, so around 2000, natural things got in the way, like having children, demolishing your museum to build a new building, renovations, things like that. But the other hurdle that we faced at the time, trying to put together an exhibition that would be the full history of computer graphics, is that question, where are they? At that time, most of them still remained with the artists. So we wrote lots of letters to the individual artists, pulled together the show in that regard. And right when we were getting closer and closer to the opening, Herbert Franke donated a large number of his own personal collection to Kunsthal Bremen. Mm-hmm. And we were able to borrow from them, and that's where a lot of things kind of fell into place. But it was really, at that time, it was a lot of hunting, especially for Harmon and Knowlton's work. Mm-hmm. Where was the original? What happened to the piece that was hanging in David's office? So it was a real adventure at that time. But fortunately, during the course of the exhibition, I was able to acquire most of the works in that show, as well as some of the artists coming to us later like Jeff and Colette Bangert, to donate a large body of their work. And I should also mention that some of the best examples of the Bangerts' works are at the Spencer Collection at the University of Kansas.
Oh, marvelous. Okay, so that gives us a starting point as we wait for the exhibition and catalog to come out. One of our viewers makes a similar point that not only is it hard to find them in collections, but he wonders if, because it was so experimental, maybe a lot of people made this type of art, but they didn't think of it as art, and therefore it wasn't retained. Do you have little clues about things that were created and then tossed aside? Are there any ones that got away that you wish you could have found or seen?
Well, that's definitely the case. I mean, a lot of times you find them and they're kind of, they're wrinkled, they haven't been treated with the respect that, that print curators would give to a work on paper. So I think the listener's absolutely right. They were not considered art because they were so experimental. But yeah, I think things are starting to surface now, as I think interest is growing because of, Deb's show, because of important acquisitions that major institutions have started to make in this field. We intentionally showed you works from the Morgan collection, from the Whitney, and from LACMA. So it takes 50 years, but I think people are coming around to realizing that there were some important contributions in early computer art. And I'd just like to say there was some not so interesting stuff made as well. And maybe it's good that we don't get to see it.
Remember,
that's what's happening. We're sifting it out now.
Yeah,
right. Because remember, when an artist writes a program with a random element, it can generate multiple examples of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every single example produced is going to be a good one. And defining that is really where it takes the artist's human intuition, not their computer intuition, to determine what is something that they want to keep, what is the example that they may have assessed when they were creating the program.
That's good to bring it back. You've given us a lot of tantalizing tips about where we can find more. Would you either repeat or type into the chat the books that you mentioned? I scribbled down peripheral vision, something about Bell Labs, but one of our listeners would love to know where she could find more information, more reading.
Right. Well, Zabet Patterson's book, Peripheral Vision, was published with MIT. So if the viewer just wants to look up Patterson Peripheral Visions at MIT. And the book I mentioned by Patrick Frank is available through the Museum of New Mexico Press, I believe. What's it called? Sharing Code. And that's specifically about Art One and the impact printer. I mean, there's a lot of publications coming out all the time, but those seem particularly relevant to the focus on output devices that we present here.
So maybe as we start to wrap up, I will ask you, are either of you brave enough to tiptoe into NFTs? Do you see a bridge?
I knew this question would come up.
Yeah, it's here. So what's your take on the NFTs, and is there a bridge between these two phenomena?
I mean, there definitely is a bridge in terms of digital technology and artists embracing new technology, but it's like with any digital, to me, well, we're in a phase now with NFTs where there's kind of this glut, and again, we need to sift through it. And in the realm of digital prints, for me, it's always about, has a lot to do with artist's intent. Like I feel if the artist chooses this medium because they feel it's best suited to what they want to express, then yes, we should take it seriously. Absolutely. If it's just a form of monetization of a photograph or a video or something they made in another medium, then I start to question it. So we just need to kind of figure out how the parameters with which to evaluate NFTs as well as digital art in general, I think.
Well, I think that's a marvelous place to conclude. I'm very sorry for all the folks who wrote in. We didn't get to their questions. Deborah and Leslie, please know that this generated tons of interest. I'm hoping that Ginny Gibbs can save the chat for you. And so before we end, thank you for being here. But Leslie, will you tell us, do you have a date for your 2023 show?
Yes, Coded, Art Enters the Computer Age will open on February 12th, 2023, banning any more pandemic delays. That is the plan, and it will run until July 2nd, 2023. So it'll be up for 5 months. So yes, come to LA. Hopefully.
Well, I'm excited to read your scholarship. Leslie and Deborah, you've both contributed so much to this topic. And you're really building a foundation, but you're also exploding things at the same time. So thank you for such a provocative and enjoyable talk. And thank you for giving us a little extra of your time as we went into more questions.
Yeah, thank you both. That was fantastic. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you to our friends at the Print Council of America. Clearly, this could be an entire symposium unto itself. And we will save your questions, those that we weren't able to get to, and share them with our panelists today for follow-up if they have time. I invite you to join us tomorrow for a program presented by IPCNY, Pattern and Print with Polly Apfelbaum and Master Printer at Durham Press, JP Russell, moderated by MoMA Curator of Prints and Drawings, Star Figura. And thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.